It was 2:14 p.m. in the Strait of Hormuz, and the water at the eastern approach to the Persian Gulf was doing what it always does in July, shimmering. The surface heat, rising from 34-degree water, created a visual distortion that compressed the horizon and made distant vessels appear to float above the waterline in the specific optical illusion that mariners in the Gulf have navigated around for centuries. The air temperature at the surface was 41 degrees Celsius. At the masthead of any ship in the operating area, it was 43. The sky was white rather than blue, bleached by heat and humidity into a colorless glare that washed out shadows and made every metal surface aboard every vessel in the strait too hot to touch without gloves. The Persian Gulf in July is not a comfortable place to be. It is also, for the commercial shipping that moves a significant fraction of the world's energy trade through this narrow corridor every day, a place where comfort is irrelevant and passage is business. MV Pacific Sentinel, a Liberian-flagged crude oil tanker of 280,000 deadweight tons, was transiting the eastbound traffic separation lane at 11 knots, inbound from the Indian Ocean, carrying 2.1 million barrels of Saudi Arabian crude oil bound for South Korean refineries. She was a VLCC, a very large crude carrier, one of the largest class of vessels that can navigate the Strait of Hormuz, her hull drawing 20.5 meters of water fully laden, her single propeller driving a ship longer than the Empire State Building is tall. She had a crew of 22, nationals of 5 countries, none of them armed, none of them soldiers. They were merchant mariners doing the work that has been done in these waters since before the concept of a nation-state existed, moving cargo from where it was produced to where it was needed. USS Cole, DDG-67, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, had been assigned as maritime security escort for the MV Pacific Sentinel since the tanker entered the Gulf of Oman 18 hours earlier. The escort assignment was part of Operation Prosperity Guardian's expanded mandate that included convoy protection for commercial vessels assessed as high risk for Iranian interdiction. Vessels flying flags of nations that the IRGC Navy had previously targeted, carrying cargo with strategic value, transiting in proximity to Iranian-claimed waters where IRGC fast attack craft and naval aviation assets operated with increasing assertiveness. The Pacific Sentinel met all 3 criteria. The Cole's presence in her company was not coincidental. The Cole had completed a full sensor sweep of the transit corridor that morning, coordinating with the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye that USS Abraham Lincoln Strike Group had kept airborne over the strait on a continuous rotation since the previous Monday. The air picture was clear. The surface picture was dense with commercial traffic. The Strait of Hormuz accommodates approximately 20% of global petroleum trade, and the surface radar picture reflects that density. Dozens of vessels at any given time in the traffic separation lanes, their AIS tracks building an ordered pattern that experienced maritime patrol crews can read like text. Among those tracks, the Cole's watch team maintained continuous awareness of every vessel within 15 nautical miles that was not maintaining its expected lane position, speed, or AIS compliance. The IRGC Navy's doctrine for tanker seizure operations had been developed and refined across more than a dozen executed seizures in the period between 2019 and the present, targeting vessels the Islamic Republic assessed as politically useful leverage points in its ongoing confrontation with Western sanctions enforcement and regional adversaries. The doctrine was consistent. Identify the target vessel, approach under commercial cover, or at night using fast craft that kept their AIS systems inactive, and execute a helicopter-borne boarding at a moment when the target's crew could not resist, and when the tactical situation allowed the IRGC to present a fait accompli before any response force could arrive. The helicopter boarding was the IRGC's preferred method for its higher-profile seizures. The visual imagery of IRGC personnel fast roping onto a tanker deck from military helicopters was useful propaganda, and the speed of helicopter insertion allowed the seizure team to establish control of the bridge before the crew could barricade themselves in a citadel or transmit a distress call. What the IRGC operational plan for the Pacific Sentinel had not fully accounted for was the Cole. At 2:09 p.m., 5 minutes before this story's opening moment, the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye on station over the strait had registered a contact lifting off from Bandar Abbas International Airport's military section. A contact with the radar cross-section and flight profile consistent with a Bell 214 helicopter in Iranian military colors, a type the IRGC Navy operates in the Maritime Patrol and Boarding Operation role. The contact was joined by a second liftoff 40 seconds later. 2 helicopters climbing to 800 feet on a course that the E-2D crew assessed immediately. Southwest toward the traffic separation lane, toward a position consistent with the Pacific Sentinel's current location and projected track. The E-2D crew pushed the contact data to the Cole on link 16 at 2:11 p.m. The Cole's TAO had both helicopter tracks on his display at 2:11 p.m. and 30 seconds. He called the commanding officer. The CO of USS Cole was in the bridge at 2:13 p.m. She reviewed the picture. 2 IRGC helicopters, 28 nautical miles northeast, on a course toward the tanker her ship was assigned to protect, at a speed and altitude consistent with a boarding approach profile rather than a transit or patrol profile, and made the assessment that the situation required. This was an imminent seizure attempt in progress. At 2:14 p.m., the Cole accelerated to 30 knots and moved to interposition geometry, placing the destroyer between the approaching helicopter's approach vector and the Pacific Sentinel's hull. The Pacific Sentinel was simultaneously advised on the merchant vessel emergency frequency to increase speed to maximum, initiate her SSAS, Ship Security Alert System, transmission, and direct her crew to the Citadel. The tanker's master, a 20-year veteran of Persian Gulf transits who had received the IRGC seizure drill briefing from the Maritime Liaison Office in Bahrain 2 weeks earlier, had his crew moving toward the Citadel before the Cole finished her transmission. The Cole broadcast on the International Guard frequency at 2:15 p.m. 2 unidentified military helicopters approaching a civilian vessel under United States Navy escort were advised that they were operating in international waters, that USS Cole was the designated escort for MV Pacific Sentinel, that any approach to the civilian vessel would be treated as a hostile act, and that the helicopters were directed to alter course immediately and return to their point of origin. The transmission was made in English and Farsi, both languages, clearly, without ambiguity. There was no response on guard frequency. The helicopters continued their approach. Now, let us examine what a Bell 214 helicopter carrying an IRGC boarding team looks like from the perspective of the specific systems that the USS Cole had active and tasked at 2:15 p.m. in the Strait of Hormuz, because the picture is considerably more comprehensive than the IRGC planners appear to have appreciated. The Bell 214 is a medium utility helicopter capable of carrying 12 to 14 personnel in addition to crew. with a cruise speed of approximately 230 kilometers per hour and a service ceiling adequate for low-altitude maritime operations. In the IRGC's boarding configuration, each helicopter would carry a fast rope insertion team, typically 8 to 10 personnel with small arms, flex cuffs, and the specific equipment required to rapidly secure a tanker bridge and engine room. The helicopters themselves are not armed in the maritime boarding role, or, if armed, carry only light defensive weapons not intended for engagement of naval vessels. The IRGC boarding team's effectiveness depends entirely on arriving at the target uncontested, fast roping to the deck before resistance can be organized, and securing the bridge before the crew can complete their emergency procedures. Against an unarmed tanker with a 22-person civilian crew, this approach works. Against a 30-knot Arleigh Burke-class destroyer with its weapon systems active, its crew at general quarters, an E-2D providing continuous overhead coverage, and a commanding officer who had spent 22 years preparing for exactly this operational scenario, it does not. The Cole's Mk-45 5-inch gun mount had both helicopters in its fire control solution at 2:16 p.m. Not a targeting solution for engagement, but a track that the gun director was maintaining for immediate employment if the order came. The Cole's two MH-60R Seahawks helicopters, which had been on the flight deck at modified readiness since the morning's transit briefing, were directed to immediate launch at 2:15 p.m. Both Seahawks were airborne at 2:18 p.m., armed with M2 4-door guns and the specific authority under the rules of engagement applicable to the protection of civilian vessels from unlawful seizure in international waters. The Seahawks climbed to 500 feet and took up intercept positions between the inbound IRGC helicopters and the Pacific Sentinel, establishing a visual and radar presence that made the tactical geometry of the approaching seizure attempt visually unambiguous to anyone looking at it from any perspective. The IRGC helicopters were now 11 nautical miles from the Pacific Sentinel. At 230 kilometers per hour, that was approximately 2 minutes 50 seconds from their target. 2 minutes 50 seconds in which every defensive element of the Cole's response was clearly established. A destroyer at 30 knots between them and the target, 2 armed Seahawks at 500 feet in their approach lane, a 5-inch gun mount tracking them, and an E-2D Advanced Hawkeye at 24,000 feet whose radar picture was being shared in real time with CTF-53 in Bahrain, with the Abraham Lincoln Strike Group, and with CENTCOM. At 2:19 p.m., the Cole's commanding officer authorized the Seahawks to execute a visual interception, approaching the IRGC helicopters head-on at their altitude and establishing a close formation position that communicated with the specific clarity of 2 armed military helicopters flying directly at your nose that the approach was not going to continue uncontested. The lead Seahawk established position 400 meters ahead of the lead IRGC helicopter at 2:21 p.m., matching its heading and speed, the 2 aircraft facing each other in the specific confrontational geometry that requires one party to either continue on a collision course or maneuver away. The lead Seahawk broadcast on guard frequency at 2:21 p.m. in Farsi. IRGC aircraft were directed to turn to heading 045 immediately and return to Bandar Abbas. The transmission was calm, professional, and delivered in the specific tone of a crew that was entirely certain of its tactical position and completely uninterested in any alternative interpretation of the situation. The IRGC lead pilot had approximately 4 seconds to assess the situation he was actually in, versus the situation his pre-mission briefing had described. His briefing had described a tanker escorted by a destroyer that would maintain a safe distance to avoid escalation. What he was looking at was a Seahawk 400 meters from his nose that was not maintaining a safe distance, a second Seahawk and his wingman's 2 o'clock, a destroyer at 30 knots whose bow was pointed directly at his intended approach corridor, and, visible in his peripheral vision through the cockpit glass, the Pacific Sentinel already pulling away at increased speed with her citadel secured. The tanker was no longer accessible. The approach was blocked. The tactical situation had been structured in the 11 minutes since the E-2D first detected his takeoff to make the seizure attempt operationally impossible before he reached the target. The lead IRGC pilot broke left at 2:21 p.m. and 15 seconds. The turn was hard, a 60-degree bank to port. The helicopter trading speed for altitude in the turn, its tail rotor visible to the Seahawk crew as the IRGC aircraft rolled away from the intercept heading. The second helicopter followed in close trail. Both aircraft turned to a northeast heading, toward Bandar Abbas, away from the Pacific Sentinel, and accelerated to cruise speed. The Seahawks maintained a trailing position 600 meters astern of the IRGC formation for 8 nautical miles, ensuring the departure was genuine and not a repositioning maneuver for a second approach attempt. Then, the Seahawks broke off, circled once over the Pacific Sentinel's position to confirm the tanker's condition, and returned to the Cole. Both aircraft recovered aboard at 2:41 p.m. The Cole reduced speed to match the Pacific Sentinel's resumed 11-knot pace at 2:44 p.m. The tanker's master secured the Citadel muster at 2:46 p.m. and transmitted a sitrep to the Maritime Liaison Office in Bahrain. All crew accounted for, no damage, no unauthorized personnel aboard, continuing transit. The Cole's executive officer drafted the after-action report. The E-2D continued its orbit, tracking the IRGC helicopters all the way back to Bandar Abbas, logging their return landing at 3:07 p.m. The response in Bahrain, in the Abraham Lincoln's Operations Center, and in CENTCOM was methodical and without drama. The incident was logged, the after-action report was processed, the intelligence implications of the IRGC's specific approach vector and the timing of their departure from Bandar Abbas relative to the Pacific Sentinel's transit schedule were flagged for analysis. The analysis would address the question of how the IRGC had obtained specific information about the Pacific Sentinel's transit timing, a question with implications for operational security in the commercial vessel notification procedures that the Maritime Liaison Office used to coordinate convoy escort assignments. The deeper question, why the IRGC had launched an operation that required the Cole not to be where the Cole was one that the IRGC operational commanders would be working through in their own after-action process. The answer was not complicated. The IRGC Seizure doctrine works against unescorted civilian vessels. It works against vessels escorted by naval forces that are required by political constraints to maintain distance and avoid confrontation. It does not work against a U.S. Navy destroyer whose commanding officer has been given clear authority to protect the vessel under escort by all means necessary up to and including lethal force, whose crew is at general quarters with weapons active and whose airborne Seahawks have been established in the IRGC's approach lane before the boarding team's feet left the ground. The Pacific Sentinel continued her transit through the Strait of Hormuz and entered the Persian Gulf at 4:33 p.m. She reached her destination berth in South Korea 17 days later, offloaded her cargo, and departed on her next voyage. Her crew told the story in ports and crew changes for months afterward. The afternoon in the strait when two IRGC helicopters turned away from a destroyer that had put its Seahawks in their face and its bow in their lane. The citadel drill that had worked exactly as the training described it. The radio transmission from the Cole, that was the last thing the IRGC pilots heard before the situation became mathematically impossible. It was not, in the grand sweep of the military history of the Persian Gulf, a large engagement. No shots were fired. Nobody was hurt. Two helicopters turned around. But those two helicopters carried 20 people whose mission was to seize a ship, remove its crew from operational control of their vessel, and hand a 280,000-ton crude carrier and its 2.1 million barrels of cargo to the Islamic Republic of Iran as leverage in a geopolitical confrontation with the West. What stopped them was not a policy document or a diplomatic protest or a strongly worded statement from a foreign ministry. What stopped them was a 30-knot destroyer, two armed Seahawks, and an E-2D radar that had been tracking the departure from Bandar Abbas since the helicopter rotors started turning. The IRGC will attempt another seizure. The tankers keep moving through the strait. The Cole, or the next destroyer assigned to convoy escort duty, will be there. The E-2D will be there. The Seahawks will be airborne before the IRGC boarding team has finished their pre-mission briefing. And the Pacific Sentinel will deliver her next cargo on time. Because the free movement of commerce through international waters is exactly the kind of thing the United States Navy was built to protect and has protected in these waters for 75 years without interruption. Two helicopters turned north. The strait stayed open. The tanker made port. Bye for now.